Welcome to the Deep Dive,
Emerald City Hockey's Seattle Kraken podcast.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Deep Dive, Emerald City Hockey Seattle Kraken podcast. And RJ, we have a big one. I know it's one you've been really looking forward to, and that is the Kraken coaching search extravaganza.
That's a good title. Yes, this episode is going to be all about the Kraken's coaching search. Who should be the next head coach? Who are the potential candidates? We're going to do a real deep dive into all of that.
Yeah, so looking forward to that. We're going to touch on the draft lottery, kind of, Kraken picking 8th. What do we want to see there a little bit first? And of course, want to remind everybody that tonight you have your Armchair GM stream for the month of May, tonight at 7 p.m. on patreon.com/Emerald City Hockey. So kind of another postseason edition. What kind of moves could they be making? Get ready. Hey, depending on if you hear a coach you like today when we talk about them, you want to see, hey, what kind of roster moves might they make around that coach? Tonight's the perfect time to ask RJ about it. So looking forward to that one, RJ.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, trade rumors abound right now with all the stuff going on in the playoffs. Teams eliminated guys who could shake loose. There's a lot of different possibilities we could look at, and some pretty fun ones I have cooked up for us tonight. So everybody, patrons, join me there. I'm looking forward to it.
Yep. And then also want to remind everybody that on Patreon on Wednesday, we will be having our live game commentary for the Colorado-Dallas game. So we had our last one back on Friday for game 2 of the Boston-Florida series. That was a ton of fun. The game wasn't that great, but we all had fun. Maybe we get a better game from this Avs Stars series, which, you know what? They have been good games. So I'm looking forward to that one on Wednesday. And do we have a start time for that game yet?
5 p.m.
5 p.m.
5 Pacific.
Perfect. Awesome. So looking forward to seeing everybody over again at patreon.com/Emerald City Hockey. And then one other shout out, and that's to, of course, Queen Anne Beer Hall for sponsoring the podcast like they do each and every week. We talked about their burger of the month last week. Still a great time to go check out Queen Anne Beer Hall. You can watch Mariners games there, check out the NBA postseason, all that kind of good stuff. So definitely make sure to check out one of their 2 great locations. And now, RJ, let's do our quick news and notes. And that is that the draft lottery happened this past week, and the Kraken, we know definitively now, will be picking 8th.
That's right. The Kraken will be picking 8th. They did not win the draft lottery. They did not move up. Nobody actually moved up. The draft order remained unchanged because San Jose at 1 won the lottery. Chicago at 2 won the second drawing. So the draft order is the inverse order of standings. And so that's how it goes. It was the most likely outcome for the Kraken with a 54.4% chance of happening. And Mariners fans, of course, were quick to point out the 54% odds the Kraken had of that. So, of course, that is what happens. But you know what? 8th is not a bad spot. I know, Dylan, you've talked plenty in your prospect chats and also just to me publicly, privately, about some of the players that might be available at 8, and there's some pretty good ones.
Yeah, there's going to be some good players. This draft, more than most recent ones, I feel like there could be a lot of different outcomes for that kind of 4 to 10 range. So there's going to be a lot of names available probably for the Kraken in there, depending on how things shake out. I'm really looking forward to it. And also, Kraken prospect pool, one of the things we talk about a lot, like on the Patreon prospect chats or just when I have conversations with people, D, maybe a little bit light for the prospect pool right now, especially with Riker Evans graduating to the NHL level. There's probably 5 defensemen that'll go in the top 10 this year in the draft, and Kraken will have their pick of probably 2, maybe even 3 of them at pick 8. So it's going to be an exciting one to kind of look at defensemen. You know me, I'm pulling for Sam Dickinson 1, probably Zeev Buium 2, if I had to order like who I think will be there and who I want the Kraken to go with. But it's going to be an exciting one for sure. Anytime you're picking in the top 10, you're getting a good player, and that's exciting for the Kraken.
Yeah, you can't go wrong with those defensemen too. I've watched some of the tape after you've told me about them, and yeah, they look very good. I mean, Dickinson and Buium, you could go either way, and you're going to have a real solid defender for a long time.
Yeah, so excited about that for the Kraken. But RJ, we are here for the extravaganza of the coaching search, and so let's not bury the lead anymore. We'll get to it 5 minutes into the podcast. We're going to get to the deep dive segment here so we can really dig in to everything. And I'm going to kind of hand it over to you as you set the stage for our coaching search for the Seattle Kraken.
Right. So if you haven't heard, the Kraken are looking for a new head coach after letting Dave Axtell go following this season. And they're not the only team looking for a new coach. Actually, a lot of teams have looked for a new head coach recently. And that's been a topic of conversation around the league because 27 of the 32 coaches in the NHL have coached at their current spot for less than 2 years. There's been a lot of coaching turnover recently. I think a lot of that is the cycle of coaches, because we talked about it like a year ago, how very few coaches had been fired last season, and now it's all kind of coming together. And so a lot of coaches teams have moved on from. And so you're starting to see a lot of turnover. And the question, of course, is why? You see this, you don't really see this in other leagues where you have coaches have such a short shelf life, but in the NHL, that is kind of the order of the day. And I think one potential reason is just simply kind of works. I mean, if you look, 6 of the last 15 cup winners won with either an interim head coach, which is surprisingly common, or a coach that was in their first year at that job. You look at last year, both cup finalists had a head coach where it was their first year with that team. It does seem to give teams a jolt. And so I think the management has realized that. And so coaches have less of a shelf life than ever. And so Dylan, I mean, why do you think that is? Is it the reasons that I mentioned? Is there something more to it? And is that the right call for teams to be so, I guess you call it, impatient with their coaches?
I think there is something to like the new coach bump and the way it kind of reinvigorates guys, and especially in a sport like hockey where you have to put your body so on the line and you've got to play 82 regular season games and then the most brutal postseason in any sport. You really need to be like all in with your coach. You really got to feel like you want to run through brick wall after brick wall for that guy. And it's easy for messaging that is trying to inspire that to wane after 2, 3, 4 seasons. So I do think there is something to just kind of needing a fresh voice in there just to get guys into that mindset where they can perform the way they need to perform. The other thing though for me is, it's just a heck of a lot easier to change the head coach than it is to go with, say, a new roster or a new core group of players if you need to, right? In the salary cap world, player movement, I mean, we're seeing like less player movement than like ever, it feels like. And so, look, if you are a competitive team looking to try to find that thing that's going to get you over the hump to a championship, it's the easiest place to go. It delivers results and it's easy to do because you just fire them and replace them with somebody else. You don't have to figure out how your cap strategy changes, try to bring in guys that are going to fill certain roles within the team if you let somebody go. Like you just kind of, unplug one, plug another one in, and away you go.
Right. You can't start from scratch with a roster. The Kraken had one chance to do that 3 years ago. They'll never get to do it again. So that's an important factor that you mentioned there. So within the context of this Kraken coaching search, though, when we look at these different names and think about the task that Ron Francis has at hand, how long should we really expect this coach to be coaching the Kraken? It's kind of an uncomfortable question because you hope that the coaching hire works out and they just coach the team forever. But as we've seen, that's not necessarily how it goes. So what kind of timeline should we be thinking in here?
Realistically, just looking around the league and how all of this stuff's gone on and how even some guys that haven't maybe been fired that we'll talk about later, but they're included in this conversation, are guys in spots where like they've had a lot of success. And in some cases, like I'll just go ahead and say like John Cooper's name, right? Like won like back-to-back Stanley Cups like a handful of years ago. Right. And now his job's in jeopardy. Right. Like that's just the nature of this. So realistically, 2-3 years, right? Like that's what you have to expect, especially because if you look at the Kraken, they are, as a roster, they're kind of in this weird in-between area. And we'll talk about this more when we talk about the different coaches available to them. But you look at the way other teams are handling their coaching searches, and you have teams that like are like the Devils, where they are very much in their competitive window. They are trying to win a championship right now, right? Winnipeg's trying to do that with their core all in their prime right now. And so they're going out and trying to find really veteran head coaches that are also trying to win a championship right now. And then you have teams like San Jose that are at the beginning parts of a 3 to 4-ish year rebuild, and they're starting to look at guys where it's like, hey, this probably isn't going to be the coach that's going to see us through the other side. This is going to be a little bit more of a stopgap guy. So let's look at, one, a good veteran coach isn't going to want to take on that job. Why would you? So let's look at guys that are maybe looking for their first head coaching experience in the NHL. And you can kind of go with that. And here's the problem with the Kraken is like, you're right in between those two things. You have a roster that's a borderline playoff roster, particularly if you add like one more, solid piece to it. Right. And you can go. But on the other side of things, you want to be developing Matty Beniers. You want to be developing Shane Wright, right? They're not really into their primes yet. They're not really where they can go and compete for a Stanley Cup yet. You're going to have the 8th overall pick this year. You've got Riker Evans, who has half a year's of NHL experience right now. I don't know. Like, I think it's going to be interesting if you're the Kraken. Like, what do you think? Like, where do they go with that? Because you can go in both directions.
Well, you can. I think this next coach is going to have a task that's a lot more complex than some of the other coaches are going to have in say, a San Jose or a New Jersey, where it's clear what you're looking for in either of those two spots. I think you have to try and kind of do both. I think, really, job number one, if you're Ron Francis and looking at it this way, is, we know that if the Kraken have another bad season, his job could be in jeopardy. And so if you're looking at it, he's the guy who gets to make the decision. And so job number one for this coach is make the playoffs next year, save the GM's job. And that's a pretty big task. And it might fly in the face of other tasks that, developing a young core, making sure you have that culture right, where you're giving younger players the opportunity to succeed. Those two things can be opposed to each other. And so I think you're going to try and ideally find a guy who can do both for you, but that just makes it all the more difficult to find the right candidate.
Yeah, it's going to be tough. And you do wonder also, like, yeah, that's not really a long-term strategy of like, it's playoffs or bust this year for everybody. So we just need to hire somebody who we think can just get us to the playoffs this year. Like that works for this year, but yes, is that setting things up long-term in the best way possible? But again, we're not making that decision. Like, the person making that decision is in the spot where that is the best idea probably for them. And that's Ron Francis.
Yeah, I think you're ultimately looking for somebody who can turn this team into a consistent playoff team. Mm-hmm. And you're not so worried about what goes beyond that timeline wise. If you can get somebody who can just ensure this team is in, because again, it's a low bar. You just have to be in the top half of the league.
Yep.
Half the league makes it. Just make sure this is a team in the top half of the league consistently every year. And if you fail in the playoffs, if you have a bunch of first round exits, then you get to that 3 or so year timeline and you can look at somebody who can help you get you over that hump. But really just bringing that stability of being a playoff team, I think, is kind of the number one thing that Francis is going to be looking for. And I think some of the guys we're going to talk about can certainly do that. But as far as qualities that can help you achieve that task, what kind of things are we looking for? Now, Ron Francis was asked about this. Our colleague Darren Brown at Sound of Hockey asked him pretty directly, what kind of qualities are you looking for in the next coach? And Francis did not want to answer that question because he said, if I answer that now, it's going to make it seem like those are the things that Hackstall didn't have, and I don't want to talk about it. But so Francis wouldn't answer that, but we certainly will here. So what's kind of the first quality or most important quality that you're looking for in a coach?
Most important quality for me is communication. I want somebody who, if I'm the general manager and I'm hiring a coach, if I'm a fan of a team, I want this for the coach of my team. I want somebody who is a really good communicator, because that's going to benefit you both on and off the ice the most in a position like head coach. On the ice, it makes sense, right? You have to communicate systems. You have to communicate what you want your players to do. You have to communicate what they didn't do well last game in the film room, and then you can work to change that for the next game. All of that kind of stuff. Communication is very, very key. Off the ice, communication is also super key because that's how you establish culture, right? That's how you're going to establish what kind of work environment your team has. That's how you can motivate your players. If you're a good communicator, you can do all of those things. You can make them feel comfortable when things are going well. You can make them feel uncomfortable in productive ways when things are not going well. And I think that all comes just from a coach who understands how to communicate to his specific group. And so that's why, for me, number one, communication.
Yeah, agree on that completely. And you kind of hit on the first point that I was going to go with when you said make guys feel uncomfortable in productive ways. And I think that's accountability. That's the first word that came to mind for me. And yeah, it will kind of imply that maybe that wasn't entirely there under Hackstall, that when players didn't play well enough, there weren't enough consequences as far as just, being maybe scratched for a game or two, particularly with veteran players. And that's a trait that I want the next coach to bring, is accountability. And you're going to need that if you're going to get back into the playoffs right away. Making sure that the team, knows, the level of effort that's necessary and knows that things aren't going to be easy. So we talked about it a little bit last week, how there's kind of a spectrum for coaching where you have the super player friendly coach, who is nice and approachable and all the guys love him, but maybe they can kind of get away with too much. And then there's the, hard ass. I think we referred to it last week.
The hardos.
And the hardo, yeah, as Morgan Geeky's dad liked to say, referring to, I was a bit of a hardo on him as a coach, as a kid. So I think I want somebody, I don't want the total hardo coach. I don't think that's right for this group or this organization at all. But I want somebody a little bit more on that side of things than Dave Hackstall was, just because I think it's going to be necessary for this group after the effort questions at the end of the season.
Yeah, either that or you could have accountability, but in a positive way. And I think of this when it comes to a Jim Montgomery type coach, who is somebody we'll mention a little bit later on, where you establish that accountability, not so much through being a hardo and really being on the guys who are underperforming, but by consistently and constantly rewarding the guys when they are performing. Right? Somebody starts showing up in your bottom six. Guess what? You're now the center on the top line for the next couple games, right? And if you're going to throw your lines in a blender, you make it more about rewarding the guys who are playing well than going the other way. And I think that there are some coaches that have had some success doing that around the NHL. And that is still a form of accountability. You are still in essence punishing the guys who are not playing well, but you make it more about rewarding the players who are playing well. And then maybe it goes over a little bit better in the locker room. I don't know. But either way, the accountability is what's there.
Yeah, no, I like that way of phrasing it, though. That is well said. I want to see the accountability there in some form, and there are multiple ways to get there. Is there another trait, Dylan, that you're looking for in the next coach?
Yeah, I mean, just kind of talking about what we just talked about, I want a coach that's actually going to dole out ice time kind of appropriately. Like this is Kraken specific. This is not I would look for this in every coach, but come on. Why is Jared McCann not your ice time leader as your forward, right? Why was Alexander Wenberg in a shutdown role consistently, getting 3 more minutes a night than some other guys, right? That was an issue under Dave Hackstall. And so I want moving forward, and I think it would be best for this group too. And again, this is where the accountability comes in. If you want to help reward guys, use ice time effectively. Use that to send a message, because that's the greatest thing you can use to send a message to guys, right? If a guy's not playing up to your standards, he's getting less ice time. If a guy is playing above what he should be doing, reward him with more ice time, right? He's on a heater, go give him more ice time. I want a head coach that's going to utilize ice time more effectively than what we had under Dave Hackstall.
Yeah, I'm with you completely on that. That was actually the next thing I had in my notes ready to talk about. No, it's okay. I even had how is Jared McCann playing less than 17 minutes? After watching, and I know they're different caliber of player, but guys still have good motors. McDavid and Draisaitl as forwards play almost 30 minutes last night in that game. I know it's a playoff game, but there's just so much room to go that players can handle it. McCann can handle 20 minutes a night as a forward. He just can. Yeah. He's in that good a shape. So I guess the next thing that I'll talk about, and you talked about a little bit with the communication, but just establishing a good culture for a young core to grow in. And part of that is not being too hard on young players when they make mistakes, having a culture where it's okay as a young player to make a mistake that you're then going to learn from. Mm-hmm. And being positive about learning from those mistakes rather than just, I think a lot of old school coaches will just tend to scratch guys for long periods of time if they make one mistake. And one thing that scared me a little bit last season was Riker Evans. He was playing great. He was playing with confidence. And then, oh no, he makes a mistake in overtime against Dallas, right? He's supposed to be guarding that guy right in front of the net, doesn't take away the stick, and you lose the game because of it. And that's a mistake. And it's a mistake at a big point of the game. But then he gets scratched after that. And he just didn't look the same for a long time after that. And so I want a coach where it's going to be okay to make mistakes, especially for the young players, because there's going to be a lot of young guys as these draft classes that the Kraken have had start to come up and play NHL minutes. I want a coach that's going to be friendly about that.
Yeah, no, I think that's going to be really, really key as a part of this. And it's going to be interesting to see how that idea gels with the fact that, as we talked about, it's kind of a playoff or bust type situation for a lot of people involved this year for the Kraken, right? And if you are in that situation, it's going to be hard to let young guys make, mistakes, because those cost you, a handful of points. And maybe at the end of the year, that handful of points is the difference between you being on the right side of the cut line or not. So it's going to be really, really interesting to see that. I'm with you. I think long term, that's absolutely what you need. I think you want to build a culture where players feel good about talking to each other too, right? Where you as the coach can engage the veteran leadership on the team and say, hey, I've noticed this guy's been struggling with this. Do you think you could talk to him? Right? Maybe it'll come across different if you're talking to him, or, hey, I know you're really good at this. I think that would be a great addition to Maddie's game. Do you mind talking to him? Right? Like, there can be a lot of relationship there between the coach and the player leadership on a group, on a team. And I'd like to see that communication maybe a little bit more effective than it has been at times for the Kraken in the past. And maybe that just comes down to, you name a captain. And a lot of that kind of gets figured out, because then there's a more traditional hierarchy and guys kind of then know what their roles as leaders are. But I think a lot of that also comes down to coaching and having those conversations and knowing when is it beneficial for a young guy to hear something from me, and when is that going to be beneficial for them to hear it from, a veteran on the team, somebody who is more of their peer and has that on ice experience a little bit more, and they can get that message across in a different way, and that's going to benefit them. And so I think that part of that all comes down to what you're talking about, where it's about developing that culture that's going to be great for developing players.
Yeah. And it all comes down to communication too, as you mentioned, is the kind of the first point. Now, do you have any other traits? I have one more that I think is just kind of a bonus that would be fun, but not necessarily a must have. But do you have any others to mention?
I don't, it's not so much a trait as it is like, I want a coach that's going to run systems that are aggressive. I want the Seattle Kraken to be an aggressive team. And yes, it's going to require guys giving, a good amount of effort during the regular season, but I want aggressive forechecking systems. I want aggressive defensive systems through the neutral zone. I want man-to-man defense in the defensive zone. Like, those are the kinds of things that I think help a group like the Kraken, especially if they're not able to really add a super significant piece in the offseason, a star level player. I think those are going to be the things that will then help this team get into the top half of the league where they can make the playoffs, because yes, it requires more effort, but that effort generally pays off. That aggressive approach generally leads to better results if you can keep it up. And so I think if you're going for something like that, I feel like the next coach for the Kraken needs to run systems that are a little bit more aggressive than what we saw from them in the past.
We're good to know we're on the same page here, because that was my bonus one. And I phrased it a little bit more as far as just fun hockey, right? I want them to play a style of game that's going to be fun to watch. And it doesn't need to be completely all offense, up tempo, everything, right? But I think aggressive is a good way to describe it. And there are some coaches here that we'll talk about that maybe have run systems that are not that way. Mm-hmm. I'll even name a name here. You look at Todd McLellan this year and the 1-3-1 the Kings ran through the neutral zone. And it's something that I think fans certainly got tired of when it didn't deliver the results, and something that players got tired of as well. And it's something that I just think would not be beneficial for this moment for the Kraken. We talked about it a lot last week about it being such a crucial season and a crucial time to build fans and build a fan base. You want to play at least a somewhat exciting brand of hockey. So wins, of course, are the most exciting thing of all, but that would be my secondary thing. So one more element to this as far as what qualities we're searching for. And that's, what are we looking for as far as a resume? Because are we looking for a first-time coach? Or is that okay with us? Are we looking for somebody who's demonstrated NHL success already? Because that's something that Francis is going to have to consider. And, there are different ways you could go with this. Do we want someone with head coaching experience at a different level? Do we want someone, we'd rather have an assistant at the NHL level? Which of those is more important? Are we okay with any of that? One thing I do want to mention, so we talked about the coaching carousel and how very few guys have kept their job for longer than 2 years. But you look at the 5 longest tenured coaches in the NHL: John Cooper, Mike Sullivan, Jared Bednar, Rod Brind'Amour, and Marty St. Louis. And as Allison Lucan, the very smart Allison Lucan, pointed out, 4 of those 5 guys are actually first-time NHL head coaches in that stint. Now, it doesn't feel like it because a guy like John Cooper has been around for over a decade, but still, first-time NHL head coach there. Does that tell us anything about what the Kraken should be looking for?
I don't know about specifically for what the Kraken are looking for. Again, if you are like playoffs or bust, maybe you don't want to go in that direction. And if I was the guy making the decision, maybe I don't go in that direction. But I think as a whole, I am interested in that, right? I would rather have somebody like my ideal candidate's resume right now is somebody who is a head coach, but at a lower level of hockey right now. That's what I want. I want somebody who has been a recent head coach in the AHL or maybe even in college. Maybe not so much major junior, but the NCAA level is probably the lowest I'd go there. But ideally the AHL level, because that's where a lot of the players that you're going to be dealing with, they're going to have spent time there. They're going to have learned some of the systems there. And that's really tends to be in hockey where a lot of the future comes from, as far as when the league decides to move in certain directions from system standpoints and stuff. It tends to be with these first-time coaches coming in and having those newer and fresher ideas, and it takes a little while for the rest of the league to figure out how to stop them. And so I want it from that perspective. And then on the other perspective, in the last decade and a half, we've seen the greatest shift in player personality, confidence, style that we've ever seen in the history of the sport. As social media is around, as they take more charge of their future, where they go, they play more towards free agency rather than staying with the team long term. And I want a coach who's used to working with that younger generation of players, who's not going to come in with an older school approach and then try to make all these new age players fit inside that box. I want somebody who understands how those players operate, what motivates them, and how to communicate to them, right? Communication's key. You need somebody who's been working with younger players. And so I personally want somebody who still has that head coaching experience and has proven they can run a staff and set up a culture for a team that's successful. But I want them a little bit on the younger side, or at least somebody who has been working with younger players.
Yeah, I'm with you 100% on that. And that's not to say some of the older coaches can't adapt. I mean, you've seen guys who've been around for like Paul Maurice is doing a fantastic job, but some certainly can't. I mean, you look at Mike Babcock, Daryl Sutter, they cannot adapt to the new style of player that there is now. And I think honestly that changes for the best. But you want somebody, who has that. And I think Dave Hackstall had that ability as well. So I do want a coach that has worked with younger players. I wouldn't mind somebody who had also had, I think if I'm just trying to build my ideal candidate, aside from somebody who's already a top-end NHL coach right now, which we can, we'll mention a few names that potentially could shake loose. But aside from that, I might want them to have one previous NHL head coaching stint, because I think second-time NHL head coaches tend to do a little bit better just because they learn some things from that first stint, but I wouldn't say it's entirely necessary. So I would definitely look at first-time NHL head coaches. I don't know that the Kraken will. I think I'm thinking about it differently than if it was maybe my job on the line as a GM. I might want someone who's had that experience before, but I would certainly be open to first-time head coaches, because when you hit on one of those too, that gives you the potential of someone who can stick around for longer than the 2.5 year average that seems like the norm right now.
Yeah, I mean, there's a little bit more of that with a new coach, somebody on their first try. One, you've given them their first opportunity, so maybe there's a little bit of loyalty there. But also, they're hungry, right? Like they need to prove themselves, and guess what? They need to prove themselves quick, right? Because they just got gifted one of these extremely rare opportunities. And I know that that hunger can be there for guys on their second time coming back and wanting to prove that, hey, I am better than what I showed before. Because generally, those guys on their second try, it's because they didn't last long in the first place, right? And they want to come out there and they want to prove that. But I like that kind of first time hunger, especially if I'm a more veteran GM. I'm okay doing something like that because I can help that guy out through, whatever issues and first time, speed bumps are going to pop up along the way. And ideally, you're finding somebody that you believe in them as a person and their character and everything. And so you're okay with those things that pop up along the way and how they're going to handle it because you just believe in them as a human,
It takes a strong culture that you've established already. And I mean, hey, if there's one thing Ron Franz knows about, it's a strong culture in an organization, right? So I wouldn't have any issues there, certainly not with Francis at the helm. So anything else to add as far as qualities, resume items that you're looking for in a coach before we get into some actual candidates, some names?
No, I guess the one thing that I would say is that we kind of split up duties as to what we're going to talk about as we go through the names that we're going to go through. And on my side of things, I'm going to talk a lot more about like the coaching systems and stuff that everybody runs. And I'm not going to have like a ton of visual aids and everything for this. We're not going to go super into depth into what those different systems mean or their strengths and weaknesses entirely. But I wanted to let everybody know that over summer, after the draft season's kind of over and after free agency, that's what we're going to be doing over at patreon.com/Emerald City Hockey. We made the decision this year to have the Patreon extend all the way through summer instead of taking the off season kind of off. And we asked the community, what is it that you want to know? And everybody came back with, can you guys do like coaching breakdowns around coaching systems and all that kind of stuff? And so the plan is after free agency is kind of, the big hubbub around that is over. That's what the Patreon content will be over the kind of the dead parts of the off season. Will be lots of breaking down. This is what different systems look like. This is how they operate. This is what they're good against. This is what they struggle with. All that kind of stuff. We'll, do like live stuff so people can ask questions. Lots of video breakdowns and stuff like that. So I just wanted to say that I'm going to be talking about that kind of stuff. And if you have more questions about that stuff as I talk about it, Patreon's going to be the place to ask about it in a couple months.
Yeah, definitely. Looking forward to that too, because we're all going to learn a lot. I'm going to learn a lot because you know a lot more about this stuff than I do. And so as far as the coaches too, I'll give it a little bit more about, their background and all of that and their history and kind of tell the story a little bit more. And Dylan's going to do that deep dive into the systems, which I'm certainly eager to hear about for some of these guys, because I haven't had the chance to watch a ton of tape, on how their teams have played. I just kind of know the general story. But anyway, let's get into it. Let's name some names. Mm-hmm. And I think we need to start with the in-house candidates because there are a couple guys that are in the Kraken organization already that might be considered for this job. And of course, the first one we have to talk about, Dan Bylsma. Where do we start with him? I guess we'll talk about his background a little bit. So Kraken fans are probably going to be a little bit more familiar with Bylsma than some of these other guys because he is the current coach of the Coachella Valley Firebirds. And he was the Firebirds coach last year as well when they got all the way to the Calder Cup finals and lost. But, if you've been a Kraken fan for any amount of time, the culture that he's built there and everything he's done in Coachella Valley and how fun and likable he is as well. But prior to that, he was an NHL player. He played in the NHL for a little while, was kind of a depth type player, then broke into coaching as an assistant coach in the AHL with the Cincinnati Mighty Ducks, fun team name there. Then went into the Penguins organization as an assistant coach with their AHL team in Wilkes-Barre Scranton, became their head coach. And then in 08-09, everything kind of changed for him when he was, Michel Therrien was fired as the Pittsburgh Penguins head coach, and Dan Bylsma was made the interim coach. And then that team went on an incredible run, 18-3 the rest of the regular season, and they went on to win the Stanley Cup that year. And so, of course, then Bylsma was made the full-time coach of the Penguins, made the playoffs each of the next 5 seasons after that before he was let go, moved on to be coach of the Buffalo Sabres, couldn't really turn them around into a playoff team, and then left after just 2 seasons before going on to be an assistant coach with the Red Wings for a few years, and then an AHL head coach. So that's the background on Dan Bylsma. But Dylan, we kind of know what he brings at the AHL level. What about his time in Coachella Valley has made him a good candidate for this job?
Yeah, I mean, you think about a lot of the qualities that we had talked about that we want from a coach, and he like checks all the boxes, right? Communication, excellent down there. He communicates with everybody. He talks pretty significantly to the media even. He's all about communication. So, but you can just see it with the way he's been able to develop players, take in guys like Ty Cartier, Logan Morrison, undrafted guys, and then within a year, turn them into players that can go and play with the Seattle Kraken at the NHL level, right? Like it means you are a good development coach, you are a good communicator, and you're a good person to build a staff around you and create a culture where those players are going to listen and trust that staff around you, and everything, that if you're able to produce players like that. So all the qualities that we talked about, they're all there for Disco. As far as like the way he the teams play on the ice, uses a more aggressive 2-1-2 forechecking system, which again, I talked about. I want somebody who's a little bit more aggressive with their systems. It's a pretty aggressive approach to kind of take. You're sending 2 forwards into the defensive zone pretty deep, trying to force turnovers, trying to pressure other teams. And Coachella Valley utilizes that pretty effectively. And then, you have to trust your defenseman on the way back and trust that one forward in the middle on the neutral zone on the way back if things don't go the way you want them to. And things work out pretty well. Maybe a little bit more passive in the defensive zone. He runs more of a zone defense rather than man-to-man. I'm not as into that, and there have been times where at Coachella Valley games I've been at, if the other team gets a good cycle going, there's just kind of no way of breaking that until they take a shot and you get the rebound, right? And so that element of things I'm not as much on board with, but overall, the Firebirds play an aggressive approach, and then, again, the culture, the environment, that's a team that never gives up, RJ. You look at that first round series against Calgary, you look at some of their games late season. There's a lot of times the Firebirds find themselves down late in games only to tie it and then win it in regulation or win it in overtime. He just creates an environment where guys don't give up. They always believe in themselves and what they're doing as a team. It's hard to say no to that.
Right. I mean, you look at that team. I mean, they play an exciting brand of hockey, and resume and their results speaks for itself. But he also has experience at the NHL level. He's won a Stanley Cup as an NHL head coach, and he's coached some of the best players of their generation, right? He coached Sidney Crosby, Evgeny Malkin. He knows how to work with guys like that. And he was a depth player in the NHL. He knows how to work with guys like, you see what he did with Ty Cartier that you mentioned, right? Helping them work their way up the lineup and find their potential. Like you said, he checks all the boxes. And he's, as far as the culture too, he's player friendly. They like him, but he also knows when to push. That's something we talked about with the first round series against Calgary this year for the Firebirds. I think they maybe got a little complacent going into that. We had worries about that. And you know what? They dropped game 1 and they were very close to dropping game 2. It went to overtime, but he got things on the rails. They ended up winning 3 in a row and they're on to the next round of the playoffs. So he's player friendly, but he also knows when to push. And he knows when the group kind of needs that reality check. And so that was huge for me, just seeing that even recently for him. I would love to just import that entire culture from Coachella Valley to Seattle. So I think, barring some of the guys that we'll talk about that are already top tier NHL head coaches, that it'd be kind of a miracle if they were to shake loose and then be interested. Aside from those guys, I think if Bylsma wants the job, he should probably be the guy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
For me, I'm willing to say that. Now, whether he wants the job or not, that's a pretty big if, I think. We've addressed this in the past, but he just seems so happy in Coachella Valley doing what he's doing. He has nothing left to prove at the NHL level. I just don't know that he'd want the job.
Yeah, that is the question. And maybe that's just a persona he puts on and he really, really does want the job. Like, who knows? But just based on like the conversations and stuff, being in and around them, I think that's a legitimate question, and we'll just kind of see. But I'm with you. If he wants it, it should be his. Like forget about it, will be, whatever, it should be his. I wouldn't even look anywhere else. And look, the Kraken would know that, I would think. internally. They are the one organization that can go and ask him while he's still coaching at the AHL level through this playoff run, hey, I know you're focused down there. That's all that you're going to want to talk about, whatever. But also, we just need to know, are you interested, or do we need to start looking at other people? And obviously, you're going to interview other people anyway. But like they are the one organization that is going to know right now what his thoughts on that are. So it'll be interesting to see, if something happens before the Firebirds run is over, we would have our answer.
And I'm sure they've already had that short conversation, that checking in conversation. And so I'm sure the Kraken know, what his wants are, what his intentions are.
Yeah.
But he's not the only in-house candidate potentially for the Kraken. And actually, if you look at betting odds or so for the Kraken's next coach, this guy is often number 2. And that's assistant coach Jay Leach. So Kraken fans, I'm sure, familiar with him. He's been on the Kraken bench next to Hackstall for each of the first 3 seasons for the team. Prior to that, he was the head coach for the Providence Bruins for 4 years. And so that's he made his name in the AHL before coming to the NHL as an assistant. He was also a former NHL player, played for several teams, 70 NHL games. I remember some of those with the San Jose Sharks, watching them in 09-10 growing up. But anyway, Jay Leach, he's been in charge of the defensemen and the penalty kill. That's been his area of expertise. And players have spoken very highly about him as the defenseman that he's worked with. Some players, Hayden Fleury? I don't want to misattribute this, but at least one defenseman has said that it's the best coach that he's ever worked with. And so that is, glowing words from players that he's worked with. But Dylan, is he ready for the big time? Is he ready for an NHL head coaching job? What do you think?
I think he is probably ready for a head coaching job, just based on what we've seen, what the players have talked about, all that kind of stuff. You watch him in practices too, Kraken practices and morning skates and stuff, and he can be a good leader of things on the ice. So I think he is ready. It's just a question of, does it make sense for this group to kind of run with somebody who was a part of the staff previously? And all of that. And it's one of those things where a lot of the questions I have around that, only the team would know internally, how much of that was him, and how much of that was Hackstall, how much of the kind of breakdowns along the way, where those all lied and everything. Obviously other teams value him. He's interviewed with the Sharks here recently, he interviewed with Boston last year. Like other organizations think that he's ready too. It's just, I just don't know that I would want to run back with somebody who was a part of the staff after things just kind of went so off the rails this year. That's my only question.
I wouldn't. I'm comfortable saying I don't think he's the right guy for this moment for the Kraken. I do think he's a good coach. I think he's going to be an NHL head coach at some point. It's just a matter of time for him. But exactly, running back with somebody who was part of the staff this year, I don't think is a good idea, given the amount of change that needs to happen. I think it'd be a very uninspiring hire. Also, I have questions about too, with the focus, the attention issues, especially defensively for guys, is that going to continue to be a problem? And is he going to be more of on the hardo side of things? As an assistant coach, you often don't have to be the disciplinarian. I don't know that he would be that guy. And so I worry about that as well. And then also, I don't know what kind of style he would go with, as systems he'd go with as a head coach. I mean, I haven't watched a lot of Providence Bruins tape to see how they did, but he's a more defensively focused guy. You'd want to bring in an assistant that really knew offense, and I don't love the fit.
Yeah. And by the way, because there's going to be a couple guys that we're going to talk about that are like AHL coaches. Outside of like Disco Dan, because I watch so much of the Firebirds, it's easy to know what he's doing, especially for these guys that haven't coached in the last like year or two in the AHL. There's like no tape. It's really hard. So I don't really have anything as far as systems that Jay Leach ran with the Providence Bruins either, because like the tape just doesn't exist.
Yeah. So that's always, tough to kind of get a read on, but I want someone with a little bit more on the resume, and someone who wasn't maybe part of this group last year, just because I think you need change.
I think that's important.
Nothing against Jay Leach. You need change.
Yeah.
So moving on to some other candidates. Now there are 2 candidates we know that are confirmed to have interviewed for the Kraken job. So we'll start with those 2 because, well, we know they're people the Kraken are considering. And the first one of those 2, probably the bigger name, is Todd McLellan. And if you've been listening to me for a little while, you know how I feel about Todd McLellan as a head coach. I think he would be Dylan told me before the podcast, he's like, I'm just going to hand this to you on Todd McLellan. I think hiring Todd McLellan would be a big mistake for the Kraken. And no, there's nothing wrong with doing their due diligence. I think you should interview a lot of different guys. And so I have no problem with them interviewing him. But there are a couple major factors why I think it would be a bad fit. I mean, the first one is just his resume as a head coach. I don't know that there's a head coach that has done less with more in his time in the NHL recently. He took over as head coach of the San Jose Sharks in 2008 after being a Red Wings assistant for 3 years. Won cups as an assistant with Detroit. And he did win a Calder Cup with the Houston Aeros in 2003, but that's a long time ago. But as an NHL head coach, took over the San Jose Sharks. They're a President's Trophy winning team, won the President's Trophy as the top team in the league, lost in the first round of the playoffs. And the next 6 years were just kind of more playoff failures until finally he left the team after they missed the playoffs, the only time in that 15-year stretch or so. So he took that team. And again, I just want to address something too, because I think it was on 93.3 KJR, but my buddy Ryan Clark, he did talk about how he thought McLellan would be a good fit. And he said, look at what he did in San Jose, look at what he did in LA. He's good at getting teams from that not in the playoffs conversation to being a playoff team. And again, I love you, Ryan, but like, what do you mean what he did in San Jose? Look at what he did in San Jose. Like, he took a President's Trophy winning team. By the time he left, they were a non-playoff team. I don't get it. So then he goes to Edmonton. The Oilers had their struggles. We know they're still a very fundamentally flawed team. He did get them to the second round of the playoffs once, but then, didn't make the playoffs again after that. In LA, he kind of presided over their rebuild, ended up getting them into the playoff conversation. I'd argue that's more the roster and how it kind of matured, but couldn't get out of the first round. And then he was fired this year. So I don't know that there's ever been a time that he's actually gotten more out of a team than what the talent was on paper. And I don't know that he could do that in Seattle. The second element too is that 1-3-1 style. He plays that neutral zone 1-3-1. It's kind of a defensive system through the neutral zone, and it's very, very conservative. And I know Kings fans hated it. Kings players hated it. Kevin Fiala had a really good answer at the X interviews this year, saying just hopefully we can try and find something different, because it's not fun to play as a forward. It's you can game plan against it too. The Oilers figured it out. They beat the Kings in the playoffs 3 years in a row because they figured out how to beat that system, and you can beat it. I think it would be bad for a team that's trying to attract more fans and play fun hockey. I'll stop there. There are more reasons, but just no. Todd McLellan, bad fit. Do not hire him. I think he would be a big mistake.
Yeah, and I think the fact that, like, also mid-year there was a lot of locker room stuff coming out of LA too about different issues with different guys. Not necessarily like a mutiny against Todd McLellan, but I think ultimately the reason they ended up letting him go mid-season was because there was just so much going on in the locker room that was taking away from stuff. And I think that he did contribute to some of it, right? The system that they play in, he obviously didn't have a good handle on it, because you had guys like passive aggressively talking in the media, not calling out players directly, but enough that we could all kind of guess who they were talking about. And it was a rough situation there. It was a rough situation in Edmonton, but it's always going to be a rough situation in Edmonton, so I'll kind of give him a pass on that. But just the fact that, like, that is the last experience we've had with him as a head coach, was kind of things falling apart in a locker room with a leadership structure. You look at, having leadership guys on that team like Drew Doughty and Andrei Kopitar and stuff. We've never, Philip Deneau, like, they've never had stuff like what happened this year in that locker room happen before. And at the end of the day, that is something that you don't want under a head coach. It might not be, something that the coach can entirely stop from happening, but it's on them. And that's the thing that really scares me about him the most, is just the fact that, like, things kind of deteriorated so quickly and so totally with the Kings this year, that I don't want that touching this Kraken team that is already gonna be sort of fragile, in the sense that you have guys on very different ends of their careers, and you're gonna be having to manage those different expectations for different guys on the team. I just don't know that you can trust him after what we saw most recently.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And yeah, at the bottom line, he's been an NHL head coach for the last 16 seasons. When you talk about kind of retreads that keep going up, there's maybe been 2 seasons if you're generous there of those 16 where his team has exceeded expectations. Not interested. So moving on to the next candidate before I go on more of a McLellan rant, is Joe Sacco. And so Joe Sacco, interesting kind of coaching path here because he's been an assistant coach with the Boston Bruins since 2014. Yeah. He's just been at that same job for that long. He survived multiple head coaches during that time, and they've kept him around as an assistant. Prior to that, he had a brief stint as the head coach of the Colorado Avalanche for 4 years, lost in the first round in 2010, and then didn't make the playoffs the next 3 years as that team kind of bottomed into the last bit of their rebuilding cycle before this Avs team that we know now. He was also a head coach at the AHL level prior to that. But you look at the Boston Bruins, especially the last couple seasons, and those teams have been elite defensively. And Sacco, much like Jay Leach with the Kraken, has been in charge of the defensive side of things, the PK. And so, he's played a pretty big role in how the Bruins have excelled the last couple years. What do you think of Joe Sacco and the Kraken deciding to interview him?
It is an interesting one, and I know that the Kraken are not the only team to have expressed interest in him over the last couple seasons, and so there's something there. Of all of the people who are like more on the assistant side of things, he's probably the one I'm most interested in, just because of that longevity in Boston and the fact that means he has been in like the same kind of organizational culture, but then seeing how different head coaches can change things on the more micro scale, right? And how they can kind of run the room slightly differently, all the different systems that have come to pass under his tenure there with the Bruins. You got to think he's good at his job too if coach after coach wants to retain him as part of their staff. So like that bodes well for me. Like that's a green flag in a big way. You look at the defense of those Boston teams. I mean, because you can go back a decent amount of time here and you look and what have the Bruins always been known for? They've got good defense, right? Whether it's the defenseman, the goaltending, or the forwards contributing on defense. But the PK and the defense has always been rock solid. He knows what he's doing there. He's been in... The other benefit of him being in one spot, RJ, is you can see how he's evolved and grown and changed with different personnel and younger players coming in. And the fact that the results have stayed the same over a decade on the one thing he's been working on, again, it's a pretty big green flag. So I think in that sense, there's a lot to like with Joe Sacco as far as bringing him in and what he can do. And I also like the fact that as much as he is a defensive coach and everything, you look at the last couple coaches that he's operated under in Boston, and they're very successful coaches in Bruce Cassidy and Jim Montgomery now. And they both like to play an aggressive transitional style of game. And I think that that's what wins in the NHL right now. That's what I want the Kraken to kind of run with. And those are the staffs that he has been a part of now for the last 5-6 years. So I kind of like that aspect of it too.
Yeah, and they've gotten the most out of their rosters. You look at this year's Bruins team, and on paper, I don't know that they have a whole lot more talent than the Kraken does right now. And they made that team into a 109-point team, into a playoff team, and I think Sacco was a big part of that. Yeah, I wouldn't mind bringing him in. Working under Cassidy, Montgomery, and then before that, Claude Julien. Yeah. Those are 3 excellent coaches to work under, and like you said, the fact that they all wanted to keep him around says a lot about what he's brought. So I think he's certainly a good guy to interview, and if he impresses in the interview, I wouldn't have any problem bringing him in.
Yep, for sure.
Also on the Avs head coaching stint too, like, yes, the results weren't the best, but this is not the Avs team that we know from right now. Like that last season, their leading scorer was P.A. Parento.
Yeah.
Like, and I think there's some lessons And so I think, there's some lessons to be learned from that for sure, because it didn't go great. But again, like I mentioned earlier, having a second time head coach, especially after all that time as an assistant later, no problem with that.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. So moving on to kind of a different group of coaches, and I think they're worth mentioning. I don't think there'll be options for the Kraken, but we wanted to mention them just in case they do somehow become available, because I think I'm going to name 3 names that if they were to become available, I think we both agree the Kraken should do anything and everything they can to get them to be the next coach. And that supersedes anything. Like we said, it's Bylsma's job if he wants it. If these guys are available, I don't care if Bylsma wants it. You have to get these guys on board if they're willing to take the job. And so we'll start with the top name on this list, and that's John Cooper. I don't think he's leaving Tampa. This is probably not a realistic option, but the resume speaks for itself. I think he's the best coach in the NHL right now. And if for some reason they were to let him go, because it's not 100% certain, they haven't confirmed for sure that he's coming back. But if they were to let him go, do everything you possibly can to get him. Enough said.
I'm going to push back just a tiny bit, and I've laid the groundwork for this on our Red Glare stuff when we've talked about Tampa, is I do think that he's starting to kind of lose things in Tampa. Part of that's just the roster's aging and the issues that they've had there. But I'm also questioning like how much of this kind of change that we've seen the last couple of years as far as systems, his ability to kind of keep up with that. Because he runs a pretty passive forecheck, right? He runs like a solid defense that relies a lot on the blue line to run things. I mean, there's been a lot of times he runs a 1-1-3, right? Like it's pretty passive approach to things. I don't know that I'm super interested in that from the Kraken, and I don't know that that's the future of the NHL either. I don't know how successful that's going to be moving forward when you're going to cede so much and allow teams to build up so much speed the way teams like Vegas play now, the way teams Boston play now, Florida played, and we've seen the results against Florida in this past playoffs here. And also, he's just getting more and more frustrated. A lot of that cool, calm demeanor that made him such a good coach for a long time, we saw that really shatter and fall apart this year. And I don't know, maybe he just needs a little bit of a break. He's been coaching a long time. But there's enough there that I'm a little less like, yes, 1000% you press that button if it's available. I think there's a little bit that's giving me pause about his ability to be successful in the directions the NHL's going.
Yeah, I think the change of scenery, if he, again, on the off chance that he would ever come to Seattle, I think that would do a lot of good for him, just being in a less pressure environment too, being able to just take a break, not necessarily from coaching, but from being in a spot where it is cup or bust every single year. Mm-hmm. I think that can tend to wear on a guy, but just looking at the resume and looking at what he's accomplished, I think you have to go ahead and do it. But anyway, I doubt he'll be available. Yeah. So we'll kind of move on to the next name. And this one, I think, maybe has a little bit more of a chance of being available. And that's Boston's coach, Jim Montgomery. So the Bruins are currently trail 3-1 to the Florida Panthers in their second round series, which if you look at the regular season results, they've kind of underperformed the last 2 years when it comes to the playoffs. I don't think that's fair at all to Montgomery because really, if you look at this year's team, they should be a playoff bubble team. But he turned them into 1 point shy of a division winner. Last year's team that probably should have been, around the division winner conversation, he turned them into the best regular season team of all time. I think he's done a fantastic job coaching in Boston. And then, I mean, his record in Dallas before, obviously things went south, was excellent too. So I think if the Bruins were to let him go, you have to give a similar effort to bring him in.
Yeah, it's some personal struggles there towards the end of the Dallas stint.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm on board. Of these three guys, I think he's the one I'm most on board with if he was to become available, just because I like the culture that he builds. Like I said earlier, he's a guy who rewards players for playing well rather than punishes guys for not playing well, right? Like the effect ends up the same, but very much the culture is about like, look, if you perform well, you're going to get ice time. And really on this Bruins team that he's coaching right now, you can afford to do that because you don't have a lot of guys that should just be locked in your top six. You've got maybe two. So it works really well in Boston, and he's been able to work it really well. I love the way he's been able to handle the goaltending tandem and keep a situation that for any other time in hockey history, RJ, that turns into the biggest media drama firestorm of what are they doing? They're going to have to move a guy, who's getting upset, whatever. And instead he's just turned it into, wow, look at this incredible goaltending tandem. Look how tight these guys are with each other. Look how much love there is all around for him. Like he's been able to handle a situation that normally turns toxic, and he's made it into just the most incredible thing to follow from afar. So I'm really happy about how he's handled that. And then as far as on the ice, I like the the stuff that they do from a systems perspective. They're a little bit more aggressive. They like to attack in transition. It's not like full sell on transition the way, say, Bruce Cassidy is in Vegas, where it's like, if the transition isn't there, we might as well just give up the puck and try to start again. But it's still about controlled zone entries, right? Go into the zone, button hook, wait for guys to enter. Let's try to attack with that secondary rush rather than trying to set up a cycle in the offensive zone. So I like that aspect of it too. I think, like I said, of these three, Mike Sullivan, John Cooper, Jim Montgomery, I think he is the one I'm most on board with.
Yeah, I think he'd be a fantastic hire. I'm definitely more on board with him than with Sullivan, who we'll talk about in a second. But I mean, him and Cooper, like, they'd both be home run hires. And also, I would question then at this point the Bruins, because with any team, when they let go of a coach, like, okay, well, what do they know? You know, is there a reason that maybe we shouldn't hire this guy? But you look at the last guy the Bruins got rid of, even after considerable success, just because they want a different voice. And that's Bruce Cassidy. And he went over to Vegas and won a Stanley Cup. And he's, I think, a top 3 coach in the NHL right now. So if the Bruins want to make a similar, hesitate to call it a mistake, just given that Montgomery is also a great coach who they brought in. But if they want to do that again, absolutely take advantage of it.
Yep, definitely.
All right. So the last name here is Mike Sullivan, who coached the Penguins to 2 Stanley Cups. One of those wins you were in the building for, Dylan. We were both in the building for. Mm-hmm. I'll kind of cede the floor to you here because you know more about Sullivan as a coach than I do. He had a brief head coaching stint with the Boston Bruins, in the early 2000s, but really, we know him for his time as the Penguins head coach since taking over, like Dan Bylsma, taking over mid-season as an interim coach, winning the Stanley Cup that year. Only difference is Sullivan then won it again the next year. Mm-hmm. And so he has that impressive resume. What do you think of Mike Sullivan?
Mike Sullivan's a really good coach. He builds a great culture. It's a culture that allows a lot of creativity and a creative freedom for his players on the ice, which is also something Jim Montgomery allows, by the way. And that suits having, coaching superstar players, right? Like he's had in Pittsburgh. I guess the question would be, how does that translate to, say, maybe a team like the Kraken that doesn't have Sidney Crosby, Evgeny Malkin, Chris Letang, right? All of these kinds of pieces around. But he's really, really solid at building a culture where, again, it's during the regular season, let's keep things loose. Let's just go out there, do our jobs, win hockey games. Everything's good. And then come playoff time, he understands how to tighten ship and get guys to go out there and run through the brick walls that you need to run through to go and have playoff success. And you generally don't really hear anybody have issues with anything that he does. So that's all really positive. I think on the culture standpoint, he is a home run. I do wonder, similar with John Cooper, where it's just, he's been running the same thing for a while, and it's just not really what works in the NHL anymore, right? His system is, again, it's more passive. It's not really about utilizing speed a lot. And I do just wonder, is that really, going to be effective at the NHL level? And especially with both of these guys, when they're leaving situations where they have all world talent, and then they would join a team like the Kraken that doesn't necessarily have that. I just don't know how that fit would work from an on ice, performance perspective.
It's a very different roster construction because you look at that Penguins team, they've got some all world guys, but very little quality depth, and the Kraken are pretty much the opposite. So I do have questions about that. The other caveat too is he probably comes with assistant coach Todd Reardon, who fans may know as the guy who, from that viral video where he was trying to draw up a play for the power play and just couldn't think of anything, and the whiteboard remained empty, that a fan took from behind the bench. I think the Penguins had the 31st ranked power play in the league last year, despite having guys like Crosby, Malkin, Erik Karlsson. Is it worth it if he comes with Todd Reardon?
No, just no.
I think so.
It's not.
I think it might be, because look, just real quick, given the personnel the Kraken have, I don't think the power play is going to be an elite unit anyway. Mm-hmm. And if you can still bring in a coach with that kind of resume, I don't know. I don't mind it as much. It'll be frustrating as hell. So maybe in that sense, it's not worth it, because we're going to be just on the power play all the time because it's going to be terrible. I don't know. Never mind. I'm talking myself out of this. Maybe it's not worth it.
I think like similar with John Cooper, there's enough that just gives me pause about how things are kind of breaking down in their current spot. That's making me go, I don't know that a change of scenery is necessarily enough to fix what's going on there. And that's my concern there. And realistically, these three guys probably aren't going to be available anyway. And if they were, I don't know that they would choose the Kraken amongst all of the other jobs that exist that would be open to them. So we can move on.
I think you're right about that. Yeah, let's not waste any more time with these three then. But moving on to one that's been talked about a lot in connection with the Kraken, but also somebody who's still employed by an NHL team who for now is still in the playoffs. And that's Rod Brind'Amour, head coach of the Carolina Hurricanes. Hockey fans have been around for a long time. Probably remember him as a player. Moved on to be an assistant coach of the Hurricanes for a while before being promoted to their head coach. And since being their head coach, they've made the playoffs every year. They've had some playoff disappointments, but they have gone multiple rounds most years. So, Dylan, we've talked in the past about, our concerns about his ability to get a team over the hump in the playoffs. But given what the Kraken are looking for right now, does that matter?
Probably not. Just being honest. And over a Sullivan or John Cooper, I think the way he runs his team on the ice, it can still translate to success in today's NHL. Like I still think that there's enough there that you can see, and you can just look even in this series against the Rangers right now in the second round that they are very much struggling. I mean, they just avoided being swept, but you look at how much his team is really putting in work. I mean, they're putting in a lot of work. Now, the one place, and we've talked about this again on Red Glare, is in the offensive zone. They're very aggressive at getting into the offensive zone, but then they kind of hold up a little and they try to play from the perimeter. It leads to a lot of shots, but maybe not as much quality. That's the kind of stuff I'm not so sure works anymore. I've kind of got on the record on Red Glare saying I just don't think it does. And that is the thing that bothers me here. But I like the defensive structures that they use. Like, I mean, he is a man-to-man guy in the defensive zone. He will run the 2-1-2 aggressive forechecking system to try to get the puck back and stop the other team from being able to break out and transition. Like, that is very much something that you need in today's NHL. So there's aspects of Brind'Amour's game that I really, really like. It's just that offensive zone system is what needs to change. And I think that's the only thing that's really been holding Carolina back these last couple of years.
Right. That perimeter play, especially given the Kraken's problems this past season, it worries me a little bit. But overall, I don't think the Kraken should be worried about that, because really in the regular season, it works just fine. It's just easier to game plan against the playoffs, and it kind of falls apart there when you have a team that matches up well against it. But the Kraken don't need to worry about that right now. For me, Brind'Amour checks enough of the boxes. He's a proven winner at the NHL level. He's going to be good for the culture. He's a great culture guy. Mm-hmm. That's for sure. He's also good with young players and developing guys. You look at that Canes roster and the young players that he's worked with that helped grow. Sebastian Aho, Seth Jarvis, Marty Nietzsche, Andrei Svechnikov, all those guys, on the younger side in their 20s. And Brind'Amour's helped them develop really well. So I like that for the young core. And also they play fun hockey. Like, you talk about the system and it is around the perimeter a lot, but man, they spam shots at the goal. I mean, they shoot a lot of pucks on net. And it's fun to watch. Like, when they control the puck in the offensive zone, they have it there for a long time, and it lets things kind of build too. Like, if you're watching it as a fan, where they just, keep cycling the puck around, they keep getting chances, and you see the energy, especially in Carolina, from the fans during one of their like trademark long offensive zone shifts. Mm-hmm. And it's awesome. So I think if the Kraken have the same 6 seasons, like starting now, because Brind'Amour's been the Carolina coach for 6 years, in any order that he's had in Carolina, you're set. Like, you've set a standard, you've delivered a fun product, the fans will be there, the excitement will be there. I would like this hire. I think it'd be a great hire if they could get him.
Yeah, and then just like internally, the fact that he's been able to do this for 6 years, and his players, including the ones who have been there for all 6 years, continue to play hard for him. Again, in today's NHL, that's very, very rare, and that's definitely a massive green flag.
Yeah, definitely. If you can have a message that has staying power for that long, for sure. I mean, that is rare in the NHL. All right, so moving away from the coaches that are already employed elsewhere, and you kind of have to wait to shake loose, to maybe some more realistic candidates, guys who are already available right now. We'll start with Jay Woodcroft. So he was coaching the Oilers to start this season. They had a disastrous start, so they let him go, brought in Chris Knobloch. But before that, so Jay Woodcroft has a bit of a unique background, because he started out as a video coach. And I think he was the first NHL head coach who had that background as a video coach starting out. And so he brings that with him. And then, so he was basically tied to Todd McLellan's staff for a long time, basically all throughout his time with the Oilers. Then McLellan gets fired, and then Jay Woodcroft becomes the Oilers head coach. And he was with the Bakersfield Condors for a little bit before that too, as an AHL head coach. So he did win a Calder Cup there as well. And then, yeah, I mean, if you've watched the Oilers the last few seasons, you kind of know they're a very flawed team. They've done well in the regular season. They have two very good players that they've kind of built the team around. I think the biggest question with Woodcroft for me, Dylan, I'm curious your take on this. Can he win? Can he replicate that success without two of the top 5 players in the world?
If he's going to, he's going to need to change his systems. And boy, changing systems for him is a massive red flag just based on what we saw from the team this past year. So one of the things that led to a lot of the Oilers' success under Jay Woodcroft was they employed the 1-1-3 kind of forecheck. It was a passive forecheck, just because, to be perfectly honest, he had to do this because his defensemen were not very fast. Right? Think about when Jay Woodcroft started in Edmonton and he's having to give like Duncan Keefe a significant amount of ice time and Cody Ceci. It was a really, really rough blue line that he had to work with. And so he wasn't able to really run with anything very aggressive. And you know, look, Connor McDavid, Leon Draisaitl, guys like that, they can overcompensate for that, right? Like they can handle that kind of thing. But that's largely what the Oilers have run under him. It's a passive approach. I don't think it would serve the Kraken very well. You'd have to see him break out of that and do something else. The problem is that's kind of the coaching tree he's been a part of. And when he talks about coaching examples, he brings up a lot of stuff like John Cooper is like obviously his biggest coaching example, like idol. And I just spent the time talking about how I don't know that John Cooper's stuff will work moving forward in the NHL as well. So I don't know about that. And then this year, what they did was he had some immediate success improving the stuff in the defensive zone for the Oilers by adding more man-to-man approaches in the defensive zone under Dave Tippett. They were very much a zone defense. It was not very good. He added in some man-to-man elements just to put some more pressure on puck carriers, led to some better results, allowed them to force some more turnovers, feed guys like McDavid in transition, get them up the ice. It very much worked. But then for this season, he kind of went back into what he said the media would call a zone, never clarified what it actually was. And to be perfectly honest, there were so many issues with getting the team to play anything consistently defensively. I can't tell you what it was that they were trying to do entirely, but it was more of a zone-based concept that was built around pressuring puck carriers by like boxing them in and trying to create turnovers in your own zone. I don't know. It was not very good. It was obvious that the players were having issues with it. They did not revert away from it. He stuck with it till the bitter end, and it led to his firing. I just have massive questions on the ice, RJ, about what he can do. I think he's a very, very smart hockey mind, but sometimes that can get into trouble because maybe you end up a little bit too smart with things and you get a little too cute and you try to go galaxy brain and it just doesn't translate, or it's going to take too long to translate, and you just can't afford that.
Right. You need that 100% buy-in from the guys, and also just the adaptability from the players and from the group and everything. And it can get very risky when you don't have that. And you look at the start of this season, and I mean, that's where I get really concerned, because he tried to run a certain system defensively, and I mean, it was disastrous. And also it looked like the guys just kind of quit on him too. Mm-hmm. And after only 2 and 10 games or so as a head coach, 2 years and 10 games, that's not a lot of staying power for that message. And for somebody like that, who's a very smart hockey mind, but who needs you to run a certain system and get the buy-in, that's a bad sign for me. And so maybe he could kind of help this team turn around to the short team. You're going to get that new coach bump, but I don't know that he has the staying power even to be that transitional coach the Kraken need.
Yeah, no, I no, they shouldn't be interested. That's it.
Yeah, agreed. They shouldn't be. But I mean, good news, it sounds like other teams are. So we let them do that. So the next guy, speaking of guys the Kraken shouldn't be interested in, The next name, and similar to Todd McLellan with me, I'm going to mostly defer to you on this, and that's Sheldon Keefe. I know you have your famous Sheldon Keefe rant from last year that we made a little Instagram short of, but tell us why the Kraken should not be interested in Sheldon Keefe, who, by the way, was, I'll give the background, the Toronto Maple Leafs head coach. For those who don't know, was the late Maple Leafs head coach for the last 5 years. Only once got out of the first round. Before that, he was the Toronto Marlies coach, their AHL affiliate. He did win a Calder Cup with them 1 year, and then he was also the coach of the Sioux Greyhounds in Major Junior. Before that, the Kyle Dubas connections. He was Dubas's guy, became the Leafs head coach, and leaves behind a legacy of just not being able to get it done in the playoffs.
Yeah, as so many with that organization have done before him. So, I'll give him that before I shred him here. No, I'm not a huge fan of Sheldon Keefe, and it all comes down to what I had said was my number one quality that I want out of a head coach, and that's communication. And I feel like a lot of what he does, he works very well with management. I think he develops good ideas for systems for teams to run. I think he works really well with guys like Kyle Dubas that have the analytics kind of approach to things and incorporating that kind of advanced stats and all of, and more of the numbers based stuff to the on ice product. I think he's really a good coach for that. And I do think that is something that a more modern NHL coach needs to have. I will 1000% be on board with that aspect of it. I just think that the communication breakdown happens between him and the players as he tries to communicate that stuff to his team, and that comes more so on the practice level and then also in games. And we talked about this again on the last Red Glare. We talked about the Leafs situation. There's great articles and stuff out there breaking down how kind of the Leafs lost in overtime in that Game 7 against Boston this year, and a lot of it comes down to they have the 1-2-2 forechecking system and defense through the neutral zone. Most teams in the Eastern Conference run that. Most playoff teams actually run that. So there's nothing inherently wrong with it. But consistently you are seeing breakdowns with it where the one forward who's attacking, that's the one in the 1-2-2, needs to be aggressive and needs to play up the ice. And that just wasn't happening. And it wasn't happening consistently over this playoff run, past playoff runs. And so at some point you look at it and it's similar to kind of what we did with Dave Haxtell and the coaching staff for the Kraken this past year, RJ, where it's, look, this is a very identifiable problem. Why is it not being fixed? Right. And I have to imagine him and his staff were telling the players, and the players just were kind of choosing not to listen. And or there was a breakdown in communication along the way. And that's what kind of freaks me out about it. There's also stuff just like you watch the behind the scenes stuff with the Maple Leafs and when he's communicating with guys in practice, and it's a lot of kind of hockey speak, and it feels almost like he was afraid at times, in my opinion, to really tell a guy like Austin Matthews or Mitch Marner, in definitive terms, no, you have to do X, Y, and Z here. It was more so like trying to explain concepts but using few words, and I'm just not a fan of that. That it just doesn't work. You're the coach. Just be the coach. Just tell them exactly what they need to be doing. And that's where I think stuff like the 1-2-2 breakdowns come in and that kind of stuff, is because I think he speaks more conceptually rather than just being black and white with the coaches, with the players, which, to be perfectly honest, is what players need. They need to just be told, this is your job. This is what you do. That's how players usually respond to things. And so that's why I'm not a big fan of Sheldon Keefe. It's just because I don't think the communication's there.
And there's an old clip that's been circulating a little bit recently after Keefe's firing from Leafs fans that have brought it up too, where he's in a meeting. I don't know if you've seen this one, where he's in a meeting several years ago, and this will date it because he's talking with Joe Thornton, Austin Matthews, I think Mitch Marner, but with the core of players there, and he's talking about some things that concern him about how the team is playing, and Leafs fans kind of pointing at it well, look, Keefe was right, and all the things that he's talking about is stuff that is coming up even now, years later, that just hasn't been fixed. And they're well, Keefe, he identified the right issues. Look, he's talking about all the things they need to be better at. And the guys kind of shrugged him off. Joe Thornton in particular actually is we're fine, lay off us, but half the battle is identifying the right things to work on. But the other very important half of the battle is getting that message through to your players where they will accept that and they will work on it. And it seems like that second half just completely failed throughout, years, if you go back to that video, right? And so that's what really worries me and why I would not be interested either.
Yeah. So those are my thoughts on Keefe.
All right. So next candidate available here is Gerard Gallant. So he did not coach this season, but prior to this year, he was coach of the New York Rangers. They lost in the first round after an impressive regular season, but he was let go after only 2 years there. Prior to that, he was the inaugural head coach for the Vegas Golden Knights. So if anyone remembers their first season, he led them to the Stanley Cup Finals. Lost in the first round next year to San Jose in a absolutely wild series, and then was let go after the mid-season the next year. After the Golden Knights, didn't win a Stanley Cup. And so that's, you got to go as a coach. Prior to that was head coach of the Florida Panthers, only a 3-year stint there. So and then actually he was the 3-year coach of the Columbus Blue Jackets back from 2003 to 2006. So, he also has that stint there that I think a lot of people forget about. But this is an instance where Gerard Gallant, he's a good coach. You look at his resume and he has helped teams win right away. He can turn teams from playoff bubble teams, non-playoff teams to playoff teams and give them success. And he does it playing fun hockey too. You watch that initial Vegas Golden Knights team and the speed that they played with. And you saw it in Florida. You saw it with the Rangers. They play fun hockey. And so in that sense, he's a good fit. But, the downside is he grates on management. Like you can see it in those short stays that he's had where they've let him go even after very good results. And that can't really be a coincidence, right? I mean, that's the downside of bringing in Gerard Gallant. And so there's a question of would the Kraken even look at him? But we have to talk about it because on paper, this is an instance where it's a good coach, but is the fit right in Seattle?
I'm so torn on this. Like almost everybody else, I come down very much like, yes, I would love if they were the coach. No, I do not want them to be the coach. He is the one I just don't know. Like I've been really trying to think about this. I've spent all weekend trying to think about this. I don't know because I think that the on-ice product would be better. I think the Kraken would be a better team. I don't know that there would be much staying power from him just because he could grade on both the management and the players. I don't know like how that would end up going. And just because you look at some of the playoff issues he's had, like he would be one of those good coaches to get the team to the postseason, but then in the postseason, his teams don't always find that extra gear, right? That's needed outside of year one Vegas, but like there was a lot of things going on there.
We got to a conference final with the Rangers in his first season. Right?
Yeah. I look at, maybe I'm just really soured on like that last Rangers playoff round where they were anemic and they had nothing. And I don't know, maybe that's souring me too much on him, but I don't know. I'm, like I said, this is the one that I keep talking. I can talk myself on either side of the fence.
Yeah. And I thought about it a lot too over this weekend. And if you're Ron Francis, this is the ultimate save your job kind of guy, though.
Yeah.
All these candidates, I mean, he's the one that might be most confident in that he can turn it around right away and lead them back to the playoffs this season. And so, in that sense, he checks that box. And you know what? I think I'm coming down on the yes side of the fence. And I agree with all the stuff you said about reasons either way. But look, you hire him knowing he's not going to last longer than Hackstall did. Like you know that already. But he has as good a chance as anybody of turning things around fast. He's not going to do any long-term damage, I don't think, to the culture or because the players still liked him. Like the culture has been good, all three of those stops, right? And you look at those teams, Florida, Vegas, New York, they've all had considerable success after he's left too. Like, it wasn't like he left the teams in a worse condition than he found them, often much better. And so I don't have a problem with it. All that said, I cannot picture this front office bringing in a guy who they know can kind of be trouble from that perspective. No. I don't think it'll happen, but I would be happy if it did.
Yeah. All right. You talked me into it.
Yay. All right. So moving on to the next coach, and that is Craig Berube. So he was he was the head coach of the Philadelphia Flyers back in 13 to 15. I didn't even know that until right now. Shows how good a research I did. But anyway, he was a player in the NHL for a long time, an enforcer. I mean, a guy who ended up with more than 3,000 penalty minutes in his NHL career as a player. And you know what? His teams match that style. They don't just play to hurt in the playoffs. They play to injure. Like he knows how to work officials in playoff series. His teams play nasty, but hey, you know what? It's effective in the playoffs. And when he took over as the Blues head coach in 2019, they went on one of the most spectacular runs, going from, I think, last place in the league at the time he took over in January to winning the Stanley Cup, which was just unheard of through that playoff run. Made the playoffs the next 3 seasons in St. Louis, didn't get very far, and then missed the playoffs last year. And then this year, they, of course, missed the playoffs too, but they fired him mid-season. So I think he's a good coach. You look at the resume, and he's been successful with St. Louis and got a lot out of that team. That that Blues team had been a playoff team for a long time prior, and they just couldn't get over the hump. And so I think he's a good coach for that. If you're a team that is just trying to get over the hump in the playoffs and play the right way, I don't think it's a good fit for this Kraken group. I think it's a case of good coach, bad fit. Do you agree with that assessment, Dylan? What do you think of Craig Berube?
Yeah, I mean, even the playoff success, like, it's undeniable, but it's done in just such a way that, like, I just can't support it.
Is it worth it?
Right.
I can't support it either.
I can't support it. And so I'm just not interested. I don't know that he's the right guy to build a culture for Shane Wright, Matty Beniers, Riker Evans, Carson Rakoff, Yanni Newman, Jagger, like all of these young players that are going to be working their way into the Kraken lineup over the course of the next 2 or 3 years. I don't think that this is the culture you want. I think if you're hiring him as a head coach, you're going to be bringing in additional players that are going to fit his style. And they're not going to be players that are going to necessarily, that's going to limit the roster spots you have open for your homegrown talent. And 2, I don't think that they're the type of players that really help your team win all that consistently until it comes playoff time, when you can turn them loose and they can go and just try to take guys' heads off. Right. And I'm just not a part of that lifestyle. Sorry.
Yeah, I can't support it. I mean, there's a reason I really don't like his teams, and a reason I speak this way about it is because I watched those Blues teams through their various playoff runs, and just the trail of injuries they left in their wake. And I don't want the Seattle Kraken to play like that. I know it pays. I know it leads to success in the playoffs, but I just don't want to make that bargain. So I'm just going to discount Berube.
Yep.
All right. So moving on to another coach, another guy who was definitely an enforcer in the NHL in his time as a player, and that is Dean Evason. I think in some ways I've seen him described as kind of a poor man's Craig Berube as far as a coach. So he only had 1,000 penalty minutes in his NHL career, of course, in fewer games, but still an enforcer there. Coached in juniors for a little while, was an assistant coach of the Washington Capitals for a while, then became the Milwaukee Admirals head coach for 6 seasons. And then he's been with the Minnesota Wild organization, 2 years as an assistant, and then 5 years as a head coach. And they've made the playoffs a fair amount. They did not get past the first round. And you could say, well, is that a Minnesota Wild problem? Because that's been very much a Minnesota Wild thing. But you look at his resume overall, and the last time he got past the first round of the playoffs as a head coach at any level was in 2005, almost 20 years ago. And so, it would be 20 years by the time he'd take over if he was the Kraken's head coach. So, but as we've talked about, the playoff success is maybe secondary. We're really looking for a coach that can get them there. Do you think Evason can do that?
Yeah, he probably can. Like, I haven't talked that glowingly about him in the past, but realistically, he can. He is that kind of guy. I think he can help elevate this team. All the years he was in Minnesota, you can look at different things and show growth and development for the group. Like, it wasn't one where things got worse under him. It was just that maybe they didn't improve enough or quickly enough. But, like, you look at, like, the power play under him, and it steadily improved. It was just by the time he left, they were, like, 15th. So, like, yeah, he improved them from a bottom 5 power play, but he maxed them out at middle of the road. Now, maybe Kraken fans would take that. But there's stuff like that. And then you look at, even going back to his time as an assistant, you look at the way he was able to work. And this was one of the things when he left Minnesota that people talked about was he was really good at working one-on-one with some of their star players and really helping them develop. He did that a lot as an assistant with Kevin Fiala, did that as head coach with guys like Kirill Kaprizov, Joel Eriksson Ek. Like he really helped elevate. Matt Boldy. He really helped elevate a lot of these young guys by working with them one-on-one. And that aspect of things has got to be attractive to Kraken management and Kraken fans, because if he's able to do that with Matty Beniers, if he's able to do that with Shane Wright and all those young guys that I keep bringing up, that's a pretty good thing. So in some ways, RJ, I do wonder if we are looking at a 2 to 3 year coach here that is just going to be, sort of a stopgap, get the team back to the playoffs, help develop the young guys, and then we'll reevaluate things in a season or two. He might actually be the perfect fit for the Kraken, and realistically, he's an option for them, right? Like a lot of the coaches we've talked about, they're going to be in very high demand and there are more attractive jobs, but I feel like this is probably a good fit for both him and team, because he can come in, develop the young guys, right? Make the team better, help get them towards the playoffs. And then, you see where things are at 2-3 years from now.
Yeah, I think you could certainly do worse in that sense. And right, we're now starting to get into that area, I think, of coaches where that might be more realistic targets as far as ones who could potentially want the job. And Evason also, look, there's been connections here too, because the Ron Francis connection, like, they were teammates together, back as players with with Hartford. They know each other well, they're buddies. So I think that connection is hard to ignore. And so that's why he might be a more realistic candidate as well. It's not a sexy hire. It's not a home run type of hire, but he could be what they need for this time frame. It's a sensible hire, I think he would be. And you know what? Like, even though he hasn't had that playoff success at all, he showed, at least in that, what was it, the last year or the year before, where they played against the Dallas Stars, like that series got nasty. Yeah. And the Wild kind of initiated a lot of it. And so it's not so much the point with Berube where they're, just going out trying to injure guys, but if they get into a series that's nasty, they can play that way. Yeah. So, there is that, at least. I don't know whether to call that a positive or not, but it's something to consider if you have the playoff concerns, I guess.
It is true. And I've been tough on him in the past for being a hardo and whether or not I think that that's a good coaching style. And I've said that, look, I don't think it lasts long. Again, we're talking about maybe a position where he wasn't going to need to last long, or he isn't going to need to last long. And to be honest, when I started doing more research into him for this podcast specifically, I kind of walked away with a very different impression from the outside impression I had from him before. Just learning more about how he worked one-on-one with those star players and was able to help them grow and develop their game, because he is really good at understanding what other teams want to do and what the systems are involved, and he's able to help those guys excel against them. And I like that. And then I also came across this, RJ. This isn't generally where I go to get my information on coaches and to look at systems and everything, but the headline grabbed me, and it's a 3-year-old post on the Wild subreddit, the Minnesota Wild subreddit. All right. And the title is "Dean Evason is actually a good coach," which, based on our podcast from this year, I had to click on. And a lot of the stuff, these are simple things, but these are things that specifically Kraken fans we've had an issue with in the past. And that's just his teams are teams that beat teams that they should beat. Right? They win the games they're supposed to win. They don't necessarily win the games they're not supposed to win. But you know what? You're at least winning the games that you have to win. They start games fast. Right? They don't turtle when they have a lead. Like, these are all things that I'm like, wow, what would the Kraken of season have looked like if we had this kind of stuff? Ice time's given to those who earned it. We've talked about that earlier in this podcast and why we're on board with that. And then finally, he shuffles lines when needed, but sticks to it when he finds something that works. And
what a concept.
What a concept for the Kraken this past year, right? Like, we would have all taken that. And so just on that one subreddit alone, that one post on Reddit alone, Dean Evason, come on down.
Yeah, that's convinced me. Like I said, I think he'd be a sensible hire. I'd be fine with it.
Yep.
All right. So going to now away from some coaches that, have NHL head coaching experience recently to some that, don't really have any NHL head coaching experience at all. And you get into some really interesting candidates here. Be first-time NHL head coaches, and you can think a little bit more creatively, kind of swing for the fences a little bit more here. And we'll start with probably the one would be most in demand, at least the biggest name that I've seen as far as a hyped-up coach, and he's actually the youngest coaching candidate on our list that we're going to look at. He's only 34 years old. So his name is David Carle. So he's been with the University of Denver since 2008 as an assistant, brief stopover with the Green Bay Gamblers of the USHL, but he was an assistant coach there for a while, and then became the head coach in 2018 and has built a heck of a program at the University of Denver with some excellent players that have come through there, including some guys that we mentioned earlier with the draft lottery thing with Zeev Buium. He could be a potential, he's going to be a top 10 draft pick, I think almost certainly.
Yep.
And one of many players that David Carle has coached there. So he has earned an NHL opportunity, I think, at this point. Whether it's going to be as an assistant, or I think he could just make that jump as a head coach.
Me too.
Like, not many guys used to do that from the college ranks straight to the NHL. Dave Haxtell was very much an exception when he did it. But given how much, I think, better the college game has gotten recently, you're going to start to see more coaches make that jump. And I think, Dylan, would you have any concerns about handing him the reins as a head coach going straight from college to the NHL?
Not really, no. I would be totally fine with it. And look, he inherited this Denver Pioneers job from Jim Montgomery, who we talked about, and we talked pretty well about. And so that as kind of the coaching tree he's under, and the one I guess mentor you could say he's had, I think he's been able to carry on a lot of the good stuff that we talked about with Jim Montgomery at Denver, and he would carry that with him to the NHL. So I think he would be good at developing a culture. Obviously, if you're going to be coaching at the college ranks, you're good at developing players, right? And you're good at communicating to players, because you got to communicate to young players and make them better. You don't succeed in that job if you cannot communicate to them effectively. So I'm pretty much on board with the idea of bringing him in. And then you look at he coached 6 years at Denver. In the last 2 of the last 3, they've won the championship. But of the years in which there was an NCAA tournament, because it was canceled in 2020, he's made the Final Four 3 of his 5 seasons that he could. It's hard to beat that. He's kind of there. So I would be on board with bringing him in and giving him a shot at the NHL. Would there be growing pains? Yes, especially I think just because he is so young. Just being fair, and look, we're young guys too. This is something to acknowledge about us, is we have not learned all of life's lessons yet, right? We haven't been through a bunch of stuff, and he hasn't been through the AHL and all of that kind of stuff to know really internally how NHL organizations work, and which relationships and when you can push, and all of those kinds of lessons that you learn along the way by coming up through the system. But at the same time, he's a really smart guy. He's had so much success here. I just got to think that that's going to translate.
Yeah, and coaching a different subset of players too, because one thing to point out, given his resume, he's never coached a player over 25.
Yeah.
Over 25 years old at the time that he coached them.
Right.
And so it's going to be an adjustment coaching veterans who are in their 30s. And I think we're both on board with wanting someone who's able to coach this new generation of players. And Carle certainly can do that. But, there are going to be some veterans who are maybe even kind of before that time, and that might even be older than him. And so, you wonder about that. But I wouldn't have any hesitation. Just, maybe some college coaches I would worry about, but he's built such a great program at Denver. The resume speaks for itself. And I think the NHL needs to get on board too with, I know they love their retread coaches hiring the same guys 5 and 6 times, but in other leagues, we're also football fans. And so you've started to see this in the NFL, where teams will go and try and pluck guys from good coaching trees, even if they're young, even if they're inexperienced. And the results have been pretty darn good. You look at, that whole Shanahan coaching tree with, you have Kyle Shanahan, you've got Sean McVay, you've got, I'm just totally blanking on Zach Taylor, Bengals. I was like the Bengals coach, the guy, you got Mike McDaniel, and, so there's a lot of that. And I don't think it's really come to hockey yet. And I think that whichever team kind of gives a guy like David Carle a chance is gonna, they're not going to regret it.
Yeah. And just a couple other things. One, you mentioned he hasn't coached anybody over 25. He's never coached a professional player.
Yeah.
Like, so like there is that like aspect of things that you can
Someone's
definitely
being
put
paid,
out there,
yeah.
that you could put out there. And then just also just to give like background on him. And I think this speaks a lot as to who he is and why in part that he's had the success that he's had from such a young age was, he was a player and he was projected to be a pretty good player. He was a projected second round pick going into the 2008 NHL draft, but it was actually at the NHL combine that they discovered he had an enlarged heart and that he was at risk if he continued playing. And so right before his career was going to take off, right? I mean, he was projected to be a top pick in the draft, and then you're told, hey, you've got this career-ending diagnosis, and he was able to take that, and he went to the University of Denver. They honored his scholarship, and he went in and he started working with their coaching staff. And he made that transition into coach. He knew he did not want to leave hockey. He had to take what I'm sure felt like his world was ending kind of news, and he made lemonade out of that lemon. And I just think that that's, again, one of those things where when you're looking at a coach, you want to see what kind of person they are. And that tells you kind of everything you need to know. He like right away made that transition and has made the most of it and stayed around the sport that he's loved, even though, the career was not the kind of career that he was expecting himself to have.
Yeah, definitely. I think that speaks a lot to his character. And yeah, I mean, he was drafted by the Lightning, 7th rounder in '08. His brother is Matt Carle, right?
Yes.
Who had a good career, NHL career with the San Jose Sharks, with the Tampa Bay Lightning. Like, he was a good NHL defenseman, so you never know, what his brother could have done as a player. So moving on to another, a younger candidate, not younger than Carle, I mean, but, young on the younger side, 36 years old. And that is Ryan Warsofsky. Mm-hmm. And I know you have, kind of some more to say about him, kind of more, you'll give more of the background and the story on him. I guess I'll just say last 2 years as an assistant with the San Jose Sharks. And then prior to that, he was a head coach in the AHL with the Charlotte Checkers at first, and then the Chicago Wolves. And there's some interesting drama and story around that I'll let you get into.
Yeah. So this isn't on him. So let's get that out of the way. And by the way, this was one where I really wanted to look into like kind of what systems he ran and stuff with the Chicago Wolves, because the 2 years that he was the head coach there, they won the championship. The 1 year that the AHL championship was played, the previous year they did not have a Calder Cup playoff because of COVID. But that season, by the way, his team casually went 21-9 in the shortened season. So extremely successful with the Chicago Wolves as they were still a part of the Carolina Hurricanes organization. But then there was a break, and this is why he kind of left coaching the Chicago Wolves right after winning a championship to go and join the coaching staff of the San Jose Sharks at the NHL level, was because that next year was the year that the Wolves really started to break up with Carolina and ultimately ended up going independent, which they are now as the only independent team in the AHL. And it came down to they had a very, very strong difference of opinion. The general manager of the Chicago Wolves and the Carolina Hurricanes organization, and it kind of culminated in this issue during the 2022 Calder Cup Finals, where Carolina threatened to fire Warsofsky during the finals if he continued to play goaltender Alex Lyon over their prospect goaltender Kochetkov, because Carolina wanted to make the team into a development track for the Hurricanes, and the Chicago Wolves were like, no, we want to be a successful team. Like, financially, we need to be good in order to like survive and for all of us to go well and all of that kind of stuff. And so he had to deal with that all that season, and it was very back and forth and very tumultuous. And then, yeah, imagine being threatened, having your job threatened while you're in the finals over something like that, and then you still go and you win the championship. So I think he showed plenty of character and ability to go through some adversity there. And hey, the coaching record is entirely there for him. So he's a very intriguing one. The assistant gig with San Jose is a little like, I don't know what you could realistically have taken from that one just because of what it is. But given the success he's had at the AHL level and everything he's been through, I would be interested. I think he's another one where like David Carle, I think he kind of deserves a shot to helm an NHL team and see what he's got.
Yeah, I mean, what happened with Chicago, that's going to turn heads, right? In NHL front offices, that'll get you noticed. I mean, in addition to just winning the championship, that'll certainly get you
Yeah.
noticed having to deal with all of that. And there's a reason you're seeing teams interview him for positions. I think the Sharks have already interviewed him for their head coaching position, as they should, given that he's already on staff there. But yeah, I wouldn't mind if they went that direction. I think a lot of it would come down to the interview. You know, I'd want to bring him in. He's the kind of guy I would love to have him for an interview if I was a GM, and just kind of see what his read in is, what he thinks, and you know, what he would want to do with the team and how he want to play. And so I think if he wows you during the interview, I think he could be a good option for you. Similar to Carle, I think he's earned an NHL shot, and I think we're maybe more open to these kinds of hires with like Carle and Warsofsky than maybe the Kraken would be.
Yeah.
And maybe we'd be less open to it if we had to kind of save our job and had 1 year left as a GM. Maybe we wouldn't be willing to take that risk. But I think for the long-term future of the organization, when you look at this kind of transitional moment, I'd be fine if they went with him.
Yeah, and he's somebody who also took a team to the finals in as a head coach at the ECHL level too. Like he has really had success all the way down the line. Just real quick, RJ, with the Chicago Wolves, coached 109 games with the Chicago Wolves. They lost 25 over his 2 seasons. That's it.
What a record.
Like is like so successful there.
I mean, he's worked his way up the way you
yeah.
should, and he's had success at every level.
Yeah.
Like, why not the next one?
And he, you know, he was successful at ECHL, became an assistant at AHL, then given the reins, successful. Now he's been an assistant at the NHL level. He's, you know, that is the next step, is just to be a head coach there.
Yep, definitely. So that is Ryan Warsofsky. So next we're going to look at a guy who's currently an assistant at the NHL level and has been for a while, a former NHL player. We remember him from his time as a player. When we were growing up, he was a player in the NHL, and that's Jeff Halpern. So got into coaching following the end of his playing career. He was an assistant coach in the AHL with Syracuse Crunch. And then since 2018, he's been an assistant with the Tampa Bay Lightning in the NHL. And I don't know, have the Lightning done anything in his time as an assistant? I don't know. They only won 2 Stanley Cups. Yeah. So there's a reason that he's getting some looks as an NHL head coaching candidate. You know, decorated resume as an assistant. And I think he's earned an opportunity as an NHL head coach somewhere at some point. You look at the John Cooper coaching tree, I think he'd be the second guy to get an NHL head coaching spot after Derek Lalonde with the Detroit Red Wings. And, you know, he's had a decent amount of success. He's helped that team get better. And so what do you think about Halpern and his fit for this situation?
Yeah, I mean, it's another one where this is his time kind of thing, right? Like it feels like he's earned it. He's done all the work necessary to get in that spot. Like we kind of talked about, when it's like, what are we looking for? I'm a little bit more so going for an AHL coach or maybe an NCAA coach rather than going for an assistant. There's just been a couple guys that we've talked about, like a Joe Sacco, that I think is a little bit different of a situation. And then I've obviously also made my thoughts known about kind of what I think about like the John Cooper systems and stuff during this. And I don't necessarily love it from John Cooper anymore. I didn't like it with Jay Woodcroft. I'd want to know kind of what Halpern's going to bring, like how much of that he's going to carry over and stuff. But otherwise, it's hard to argue with the success. He's been part of a successful organization, part of a successful culture. That's just the stuff that the Kraken need.
Yeah, and I think he could be a good head coach in the NHL, but I don't like his fit for this time, for this team, just because he has no head coaching experience at any level. And that's something that I think really for me would be a disqualifier for somebody. Nothing against Halpern specifically. I just want somebody who has been a head coach at some level, and he hasn't had the opportunity to do that yet. So that's why I would lean toward no, but it's not really anything against him.
Yeah, agreed.
All right. So going to finish it off, since we said we might prefer an AHL head coach type, we'll talk about a couple AHL head coaches right now who have built up quite the resumes for themselves. And we'll start with Todd Nelson. So Dylan, he's the defending champion as a coach of the Calder Cup, an event that you probably remember pretty well.
I do.
Given that you were there in the building for it, got to go out on the ice as they were celebrating the Hershey Bears win over the Coachella Valley Firebirds. And the Hershey Bears, the top team in the AHL for the regular season this year. I mean, that is just a really, really solid squad. I mean, what did you see from them? I know you have only watched limited, in person anyway. But like, what'd you see from them and how they played and how they were able to beat the Firebirds that we know how good they are?
Yeah, I mean, they're just a machine. They go out there and they're a little bit more passive. But they're passive in the sense that, like, if you think of like the Tampa teams and how they won their championship, where it's like we're gonna cede some ground to you, but then we're just gonna kind of suffocate you in our own zone, and then we're gonna be able to counterattack as you're still trying to figure out what just happened to you. Like that's kind of how things work with this Hershey Bears squad. And it's a good like veteran AHL kind of squad, right? Like that's the kind of stuff that he's coaching. He is coaching at the AHL level to win championships. His previous AHL head coaching stint was with the Grand Rapids Griffins, where he again won a championship there. So he has a history of winning championships at the AHL level. He has a pretty extensive head coaching history at the AHL level, and one of the things that kind of gives me pause, because all this AHL success is definitely good, and I've seen what he's been able to do, and he can work really well with the pieces he has, all that kind of stuff. Because, you know, this Hershey Bears team isn't necessarily like a world beater from a talent standpoint, but he turns them into one. It's just that I think he just might be at this point an AHL guy, right? Like you go back, he was coaching in the AHL as an assistant with the Chicago Wolves in 2006. They go back all the way to 2002, actually. He started as an assistant with the Grand Rapid Griffins. But he's been a head coach for 10 years at the AHL level. Not consecutively, but 10 years total. And I just look at that, and I look at the fact that he's popped up several different times to be an assistant at the NHL level, and outside of the 1 year where he had to take over in Edmonton as the head coach and help them secure Connor McDavid, I just go, I think there's got to be maybe a reason why he continues to go back to be head coach at the AHL level, and his stints as an assistant at the NHL level are not very long.
Yeah, that's what I tend to think too. Generally, with someone who's working up from the AHL, I'd rather see kind of that linear progression. That would tell me more that, you know, they're kind of deserving of that shot at the next level. And yeah, I just, you know, I look at it, and he has been an assistant for some good teams, right, in the NHL. But yeah, I think he might just be the best fit would be a really good AHL head coach. And, you know, maybe if Dan Bylsma takes the Kraken job, you know, you try and lure him away from Hershey, see what you can do, see if he likes golf. Because I think he'd be a great fit for that sort of thing. But yeah, I don't know that I'm totally sold on him, you know, in this crucial moment for the Kraken. Now, talking about that linear progression, though, of an AHL head coaching job. And the next guy I want to talk about, and I think he's the last one that we'll mention, because this is a long podcast.
Yes.
And hopefully we've got whoever the Kraken hire, hopefully it's someone that we've already talked about, because we've tried to cover as many names as possible. But the last name, and I don't hear anyone really talking about him, even though we mentioned him when the Kraken were looking for Hackstall originally. He was someone who was on our list where we're thinking, you know, maybe it's a little earlier for him to get a shot right now, but in a few years he could make it. And I think he's built up that resume now. And that's Carle Taylor, who is currently the head coach of the Milwaukee Admirals. And with him, he's almost the same age as Todd Nelson, right? Yeah, he's 1 year younger than Todd Nelson. But you do see more of a linear progression there. He was a head coach in the ECHL for 6 years. Then he was an assistant in the AHL for 5 years. Brief stop actually with the Portland Winterhawks in junior. But, you know, aside from that little blip. And then he became a head coach in the AHL with Milwaukee. And he's kind of been building that resume from there and made a really impressive team. I mean, we also saw them play in the playoffs last year against Coachella Valley. The Firebirds did beat them, but man, the Admirals gave them a run for their money. And they were even better from a regular season standpoint this year. So what do you see from Carle Taylor? Because I know we both kind of like him.
Yeah, no, I really like him. I like what he's been able to do. You talk about the progression, and boy, has it been a pretty linear progression for him as a head coach at the AHL level. You go from losing in round one to the next year there's no playoffs, but your point percentage was .714, so pretty good in that half season. And then you lost in round two, and then last year they lost in round three. I mean, I guess that would say they're going to lose in the championship this year. Hopefully that doesn't happen. It means Firebirds didn't get there, but he checks all the boxes. We talked about it, 3 years ago with should the Kraken bring him in, and he looks like somebody who's ready for that NHL spot and that opportunity. And he's been equally good developing young players to send to Nashville as he has been at winning with the kind of AHL level talent and getting the most out of those kinds of guys and coaching with that balance in Milwaukee. So and that's kind of what the Kraken are in, right? Kraken are right now, come full circle to how we started this conversation, RJ, and it just clicked in my mind. Kraken are an AHL team. You've got young guys you've got to develop. You've got a bunch of veterans who are just like looking to win now. Like that's most AHL team setups. It's just that the Kraken have that at the NHL level. And so why not bring in a guy who can maximize that and do both really well like Carle Taylor has with the Milwaukee Admirals?
Yeah, I think it'd be a smart hire and one that probably would get some questions from outside people, just given that no one's really talking about him. Mm-hmm. But, if they break the news and that's the name that they hire, right? I think, we've had our eyes on this for a while and we both be happy with it. And if they go with a different guy at head coach, I don't know, I might see if he'd be interested in an assistant role.
Yeah.
That's kind of been the path that he's had over his career. And I think he'd be a good assistant coach to have at the NHL level too. Certainly if a new head coach wants to get a new staff in there, get new assistants, I think he could be a good option.
And I got to think that also maybe he'd be open to something like that, especially after there was just like head coaching turnover in Nashville and he wasn't promoted. Like maybe then you'd be looking at, okay, like my future might not be with this organization, or at least not in the time frame I'm looking for. I don't know. I mean, that's obviously conjecture, but that's the way I would think about it.
Right. No, that certainly could be a factor there. So, he's a name to keep an eye out for as he just keeps on progressing, and you got to think he'll get to the NHL level at some point.
Yep, definitely. I just want to add one more thing on David Carle, just because we talked about his success at the University of Denver, but also he coached the World Junior Team USA team that just won gold. So like he's been able to replicate it outside of the University of Denver, at least on a small scale there. So just want to throw that in with David Carle. This has been a long enough podcast, I'm sure, for most people. We're 5 minutes away from being 2 hours on the recording.
Oh man!
As I was thinking about
a very
RJ,
deep dive.
When we got to Greg Berube, I was like, you know what, we probably should have made this two-parter and done some of this next week, because I don't know what we're supposed to talk about on Deep Dive next week, actually.
Unless they go and hire someone. I don't know.
Yeah, but we'll figure it out. Hopefully this nice, big, juicy podcast will be able to tide everybody over for the week to come. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Thanks to Queen Anne Beer Hall for sponsoring the podcast. Check out RJ's Armchair GM stream later on tonight. If you've made it through the full 2 hours already today, check out the Armchair GM stream tonight at 7 over at patreon.com/Emerald City Hockey, and join us Wednesday for that live commentary game for the Avs Stars. Really looking forward to seeing that with everybody, and we will catch y'all next time.
Hey everyone, before we go, we just wanted to give a quick shout out to all of our awesome patrons over at patreon.com/Emerald City Hockey, especially our Terror of the Deep patrons:
Aaron, Absurdly Sane, Alaska Joe, Alex, Amanda, Amy, Andrew, Andy, Anonymous, Anthony, Becca, Beef, Ben, Brad, Brady, Brett and Sarah, Bryce, Burnt Creme, Caden, Kaylin, Kat, Kaylin, Chandler, Charles, Shazzle Dazzle, Chip, Chris, Clutch, Cody, Connor, Coop, Corey, Cutter, Dan, Danny39, Denise, DJ Singletone, Duthin, Dylan, Evie99, Eli, Elizabeth, Ethan, Evan, Fusion Mix, Gaby, Gabrielle, Gary, Gregory, Helena, Habak, Jane, Jenna, Jessica, John, Joni, Joseph, Josh, Joshua, Julia, Justin, Katie, Kepler, Kevin, Kitty B. Kraken, Cole, Kyle,
L. Bell, Leanne, Levin, Light, Lena, Little Tennis Guy 8, Lonnie, Mac and Cheese, Maeve, Mark, Martin, Max, Maya, Michael, Michelle, Nick, Night Drop, Nunya, Olivia, Paige, Patty, Paul, Rayanne, Randall, Rebecca, Robert, Rock Liquor, Ryan, Sarah, Scott, Sia Kraken, Sean, Sergey, Sergeant Pickles, Shannon, Skeletal Tendency, Stacy, Steven, Striatic, Tasty Kobold, Taylor, Team 114 Chris, Ty, Virginia, Wendy, Where the Slovakians At, and Zoe. Thank you so much for making all this possible. We really appreciate your support.